Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel and those of you listening on OPB radio or KBPS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, October 23rd for this week's Friday Forum. Our speakers today will address the issue of whether a private business model can work for public universities. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I'll remind you again to please silence any cell phones or noise-making devices. Thank you. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, whose generous financial support make these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please help me welcome as our sponsors the law firm of Baron Lieben and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Architects. City Club's annual fund is in full swing. Donations to this fund play a significant role in supporting City Club and all of its efforts, so I would please encourage you, if you have not already done so, to consider giving to the annual fund. I believe there are envelopes on the table, and if you'd like to leave a check before you depart at the end of the day, oh, no, I'm being told they're not on the table. At any rate, we would be happy to take your money through our website or through a check in the mail. So thank you, and please support the club. At next week's Friday Forum on October 30th, we will learn about the state of Black Oregon, including the disparities between white and Black Oregonians, and what policy changes might help address these inequalities. And now on to today's program. In 2004, Governor Kulongoski wanted to create an innovative and entrepreneurial system of administration that would stabilize income and costs for Oregon's public universities. To accomplish this, he appointed a number of prominent business people to the Oregon State Board of Higher Education. Today, we will hear from 3 of these appointees. They will discuss their experiences on the board and will propose changes that might make the Oregon university system more efficient, effective, and financially viable. Our first speaker today is Kirby Dyess. Kirby worked for 23 years at Intel before retiring in 2003 from her position as Corporate Vice President and Director of Operations for Intel Capital, the largest venture capital organization in the world. There, she and her team were responsible for 50 acquisitions and managed a portfolio of over 400 companies worldwide. Today, Kirby is a principal at Austin Capital Management, where she evaluates, invests in, and assists early-stage companies in the Pacific Northwest. Today's second speaker will be Donald Blair. Don is currently the Chief Financial Officer for Nike, where he is responsible for the worldwide financial functions of the company, which include financial planning, budgeting, and forecasting. Prior to joining Nike in 1999, he worked for many years and in many roles at the Pepsi Bottling Company, completing his time there as Senior Vice President of Finance. Donald Blair holds an MBA in Business Administration from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Our final speaker today is John Van Schlegell. John is co-founder and managing partner of Endeavor Capital, a private equity firm investing in leading Western companies and management teams. Prior to co-founding Endeavor Capital, John was one of 5 general partners at GTCR, a private equity firm in Chicago. John is a graduate of Stanford University and has an MBA from Stanford's Graduate School of Business. He serves on many nonprofit boards and is on the advisory board of U.S. Bank of Oregon. Please help me welcome today's first speaker, Kirby Dyess.
Thank you, Sue, and I'm very happy to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. In 2004, John and Don and I and several others joined the Board of Higher Education, and at least for me, it was a passion around higher education, both from an individual standpoint, i.e. it changes lives, but also from a state perspective. I'd been lucky enough to be part of a site selection committee at Intel, and it was very clear that the #1 priority when you're looking for a site, particularly when you're in a competitive company situation, is the educational level of the citizenry in that level. And so I said, boy, this is such an opportunity and an area that I really wanted to focus some attention on when I retired from Intel. So as we took a look at the system, there were some really interesting challenges, and we'll Don and John will talk a little bit about those and some suggestions there. There was also some incredible excellence and assets that we had within the system. And frankly, I'd spent probably most of my time running around the world as opposed to spending a lot of time in Oregon. And unfortunately, I missed what was really part and parcel of the educational institutions that we had. So I'm hoping to provide you with a little snippet of, what is there. And for those that are not aware, when we talk about the Oregon University system, we're talking about 7 institutions, 3 of which are Portland State, Oregon State, and University of Oregon are both research-focused as well as learning-focused, obviously. We also have 3 what we call smaller universities, Southern Oregon, Western Oregon, and Eastern Oregon University. We used to call them regionals, but very honestly, regionals probably don't fit as well as it did at one time. We also have a technical institution called Oregon Institution of Technology that is part of the university system. And we generally try to manage the system as a portfolio of institutions, i.e., so there's not an awful lot of overlap, et cetera. And it's very, very interesting when you look at the history of how we got there and how we've managed that way. And it's actually worked pretty well and given Oregonians a great benefit because we've gotten more for our money as a result. Over the past 10 years, the OUS system has grown in enrollment fairly substantially. We are growing at double the national rate in admissions and enrollment. We've got about 87,000 students today within the system, probably growing as we speak because those numbers aren't final for this year, but a significant growth in just number of students. And during this period of time, in general, funding has diminished. And so at the same time we've got demand, at the same time we actually want to meet that demand, we're falling off. Another statistic that is somewhat concerning is if you look at adults that are 25 to 36 and adults that are 55 to 65, my generation, for the first time in history, you'll find that the educational level of those in my generation is actually higher than the educational level of those in the 25 to 36-year-old category in Oregon. And that is a real concern because we're not going forward in this state, we're going backwards, and we're really not meeting the requirements of the state for the employers that are here or also for the potential employers of the future. Our retention and graduation rates have risen very, very substantially and are some of the highest in the nation. Our students, which is very, very interesting, we go back after 2 years and ask our students what they thought of their experience in our institutions. The students rated as 4.2 out of 5 in the most recent survey of the 2006 and 7 students in the quality of their education out of a state-funded institution. 90% of the students participated in some level of applied learning, often leading to their first job out of college. So either through internships, sometimes community service, sometimes research projects, but always something beyond. And one of our goals has always been to make sure that the students within our system have a hands-on opportunity to actually learn as they do at the same time. Another very, very surprising statistics, and these are very consistent year over year as we map this, 91.6% report being employed or continuing their education after graduating from our state-supported institution. Or 5% are, another group are engaged in activities of their choice. So basically, we've got about 97% of the students that we go back and arbitrary, we're just take students at random and get the feedback. 97% of them are pursuing something that is very beneficial to the state, or they're staying home, or they're pursuing some community service that they have chosen to do. So they're not unhappy with the educational level that they're getting. Obviously, there's a lag in this data, and we can't get the graduates right away. You've got to kind of wait for them to settle down. The other thing that was very, very impressive to me is I had an opportunity to run a committee as part of the board called Academic Excellence and Economic Development. And the goal was kind of to look out and say, in 40 years, what are the assets that we've got in our university system that might be the economic development engines for the state 40 to 50 years from now. And it was probably one of the most interesting and challenging assignments I've ever gotten. I thank the governor for it. At the time that I got the assignment, however, I was petrified. I said, this is a lot of work, and I don't know if I can do this. But it was fascinating to see, what we actually had. One of the things that came out very, very loud and clear is the level of expertise in research and sustainability factors that we have within our institution, whether it is farming sustainability, whether it's water sustainability, whether it is energy sustainability. Across all of our institutions, including the smaller institutions, we've got significant amounts of research going on that is being used by industry today. The other thing that was fairly fascinating is when you look at the faculty members within our system, we are 5th in the nation. Our faculty is 5th in the nation in attracting research dollars. In other words, the average number of dollars per faculty member in our entire system is 5th in the entire nation in attracting federal dollars. And for those of you that are at all familiar with the federal system for getting grants, it is highly competitive because the monies have shrunk, and as a result, the number of applications have gone up for the amount that's there. So the fact that our faculty are that productive there is very, very impressive. In addition to that, we've got a very, very healthy transition of the research into actually actively using it within businesses, either through licensing or starting new businesses, et cetera, and through the graduates of the program. So very, very impressive. One of the things that was quite interesting to me, Sue said earlier that I invest in early stage companies, and I've got about 14 of them that I invested in. And I invested in one that's called Prolific Software. You may have read about them on the front page of the Oregonian here recently. They just got an award from one of the business publications as one of the most promising companies in the nation. And it's interesting when you go back and look at where did this start from and where did this company come from. And it came from 3 graduates of our institutions who had a great idea when they graduated from college, got together, formed a company in '99, really kicked it off in 2000, and are now one of the more promising companies in the world. It's a very, very interesting story, and I won't go through all the detail, but very, very interesting. One of the other things that I ran across here recently is there's a couple of economists in Wisconsin that have done some interesting studies on a quantitative model that estimates the present discounted dollars of increased academic degrees. So as you increase the number of degrees, for instance, within Wisconsin in this situation, it's interesting that it's Wisconsin because it's very similar to Oregon, actually, so I think we can draw some conclusions here. But it's fascinating that the degree of social and economic and governmental consequences are quite interesting. But what they found is the University of Wisconsin has demonstrated that the entire K-12 and public university system of that state is financed by the value added of the college graduate sector of its population. So for instance, the number of graduates and the tax revenues that they get out of those graduates essentially fund the entire education entity for the state. And my guess is if we were to look at Oregon, it might be very, very interesting to see what the difference is. I mean, obviously, the earning power of a college graduate is very, very significantly higher than a high school graduate in today's world. And that is getting higher as the years go on. So it's pretty interesting to kind of step back and say, gee, is higher education really something that we want to treat as a cost center, or do we really want to treat it more as a strategic investment for the future of Oregon? And I think we want to treat it as a strategic investment for the future of Oregon. And we have some structural issues and some funding issues to deal with. Thank you.
You know, a lot about our system is something that we should be tremendously proud of. And I do want to second what Kirby said, that when we first joined the board, I think all of us were just amazed at what the university system has accomplished over time. So if we're so proud of all of this, why are we talking to you here today? And very simply, we believe that the situation we have right now is not sustainable. I'm going to talk about why, but that's really the bottom line. You know, as part of the long-range plan that we completed for the Oregon University system, we did most of the work in 2005 and 2006. We identified 3 key strategies, and those represented the actions that we believed were most important for the university system to achieve its long-term goals. And one of those strategies was the following. It said, assure the long-term financial viability of and adequate support for the Oregon University system and its institutions through creation of effective governance, organizational, and financial models. You know, I want to start by saying that we never saw the Oregon University system as a business. It's obviously far more than that. And the goals that we outlined for the system when we went through the strategic planning process were completely different from the goals that you would see for a private enterprise that's really focused on making money and profitability for its shareholders. But it also seems fairly obvious that for an organization the size of the Oregon University system, you have to have a stable financial platform to support the organization and achieve the long-range goals. And as we dug into the financials of the system when we first joined the board, we began to realize how fragile that platform really was. The university system had at the time, and still has, endured years of declining state support and rising costs, particularly for things like salaries and benefits. And while our institutions had proved to be incredibly resilient in the face of all of that, the financial squeeze was putting increasing pressure on the universities, on the faculty, on the staff, and on the students. Equally alarming to us was the potential that we would start to lose all of those things that Kirby was talking about. The erosion of quality of the institutions, so that people would have degrees that ultimately did not fulfill the promise of a higher education. So ultimately, as we worked through our first budget cycle, we learned more about how the system worked. We realized that not only was the issue financial, but it was also organizational and governance related. So in other words, while we realized that the system needed more money, there also needed to be improvements in how we deployed the money. So to give you a sense of some of the issues, I want to talk about 3 key aspects of the Oregon University system's financial structure. And these may sound like these are corporate terms, but obviously any institution's financial model is going to have some of the same components. I want to talk about revenue. So where do the resources come from? Cost, how do we spend them? And flexibility. So first, let me talk about revenue. In fiscal 2009, revenue for the Oregon University system was about $1.8 billion. So this is almost a $2 billion entity in terms of resources coming in and going out. There are 3 major components to the revenue equation: state appropriations, tuition and fees, and research grants and contracts. And then there are some other miscellaneous revenue items that make up about 10% of that $1.8 billion. Let's talk about state appropriations first. State appropriations actually make up only 19% of the Oregon University revenues. So the state of Oregon actually provides less than 20%, so less than 1/5 of the resources that actually operate the Oregon University system. In 1995, that number was 31%. So in 1995, the state was supporting 31% of the Oregon University system. Today, that's about 19%. The state's total dollar contribution has gone up since 1995, but it's gone up at a much slower rate than our student enrollment. So if you look at state support per student, it's actually gone down 11% since 1995. And that's in absolute dollars. So if you take into account inflation, it's obviously gone down a lot more than that. Oregon now ranks 41st out of the 50 states in terms of support for public higher education. And actually, you may not believe it, but I'm actually thrilled to see that number, because when we left the board about 6 months ago, the latest available data was that we were 48th out of 50. I actually don't think we've moved up so much as other people have potentially gone down. So it's a bit of a mixed blessing. The state provides, as I said, less than 1/5 of the resources to support the Oregon University system, but the budget and financial planning process for the entire enterprise really is built around that state support. So the entity actually operates like a state agency, even though the majority of the money comes from somewhere else. And I want to talk a little bit later about how that's reflected in budgeting and so on, but it certainly makes life a little more complicated. So the second major component of the revenue model for the Oregon University system is tuition and fees. And that obviously comes from students and their families. 46% of the Oregon University system revenue in fiscal 2009 came from tuition and fees. In 1995, that was 39%. So we've gone from 39% supported by the students and their parents. And by the way, there is also financial aid, I should acknowledge that, but tuition and fees was 39% in 1995, 46% today. So students and their families are bearing a much larger proportion of the cost of public higher education than 15 years ago. Revenue per student from tuition and fees has increased 70% since 1995. So state support has gone down 11% per student. Tuition and fees has gone up 70%. Although this revenue from tuition fees doesn't actually come from the state, it is regulated, if you will, by the state. So in most biennia, the state will cap the increases in tuition and fees, and at times has also set limits on the amount of financial aid or fee remissions that can be used to support people who can't pay. And in addition to the hard restrictions, there's a number of more subtle restrictions on tuition policy that limit the institution's ability to set different levels of tuition based upon the nature of the program, the demand for the courses, or the ability of the students to pay. One other point that has been discussed quite a bit, interest on that tuition and fees that students pay before it's then used for expenditures does not go to the institutions, it goes back to the state. So, you know, the institutions collect tuition and fees, put it in the bank, the interest goes to the state. The result is that if you think about this for just a moment as if it was a business, the institutions really don't have the ability to completely control how they price the product. And you know, that means that certain courses with higher demand or less capacity, you can't necessarily be as flexible as you might want to be in terms of structuring tuition and fees. One other point I found particularly interesting about this part of the equation is that very important to the equation is non-resident students. You would expect for a public university that we are educating Oregonians, and we are. About 80% of the students in the Oregon University system are Oregonians. But for the remaining 20% of the students, the revenue that comes from each of those students is more than twice what the institutions get for Oregonians, even after you consider the state support. So tuition and fees for an Oregon student plus state support is less than half of what a non-resident student pays. So those 20% of the students that are non-residents are actually subsidizing Oregonians. And that's actually reasonably good news for Oregonians, but it only works as long as we can attract them to Oregon with a very high quality education and an outstanding student experience. So if we let the educational experience go down, then ultimately those non-resident students who are helping us educate Oregonians can walk with their tuition dollars somewhere else. So let me talk about the third major element of the revenue equation, and that's research, grants, and contracts. 25% of the Oregon University system revenues in '99 came from grants and contracts, and that was 20% in 1995. And as Kirby indicated, our faculty are some of the most productive in the world at attracting these dollars. But obviously, while these dollars coming in for grants and contracts help cover some overhead, there's a lot of costs associated. Total revenue for the system is growing about 5% a year. So let me now take to the cost side of the equation. Total costs for the Oregon University system have actually grown faster than revenue, about 6%. And on a per-student basis, they've only grown about 3%, which actually is pretty good, but it's not really happening in a sustainable way. Compensation and benefits make up 2/3 of the cost of the Oregon University system, and they've grown at a compound rate of about 7% a year. A large portion of those costs are really not controlled by the system. So first, let's talk about the faculty. Salaries for faculty are really a function of a national labor market, and that includes not only better funded public institutions, but it includes private institutions like my alma mater, who have, at least until the last market downturn, had record endowments. On average, university salaries in Oregon, faculty salaries, are about 15% below the median in the United States. So we're 15% below the middle in terms of how we pay our faculty if you look at salaries, and we'd be even farther below the private institutions. Now, if you include benefits, the story seems to get a little better. Oregon faculty are only 6% below the median if you include benefits. Unfortunately, as you've heard the old phrase, you can't always eat benefits. So if you think about the pay package and the cost of living in Oregon and the uncertainty surrounding the financial health of the system, those are all factors in a large number of failed faculty searches that we've had over the years. For other OUS employees, the state agreements with other public employee unions helps really establish what the benchmark is for the Oregon University system. So comp and benefits for those are really on the same pattern as the other state public employees. So again, that's not something the institutions can control. As I said earlier, retirement and medical benefits are a key driver of cost. There's been a lot written about the public employee retirement system, PERS, also about the medical program called PEB. There were some steps taken to improve PERS, and that seemed to work for a while. However, the financial crisis has raised this issue again. I have seen some projections by the PERS actuary saying that the current cost of the retirement program, which is about 18% of salaries, which is over $130 million for the Oregon University system, that 18% could go up to as high as 24% over the next 2 biennia and potentially even higher. So that's obviously a significant issue, and once again, something the institutions really cannot control. And the medical program, the costs for the system is over $175 million a year, and the costs of that program, as many others are rising rapidly, about 10% a year. And while the program is broadly comparable to a lot of other institutions, about 100%, virtually 100% of the cost in Oregon is actually borne by the employer. So very, very large portion of the cost structure of OUS, and again, not quite under control of the system. So how about the other third of the cost structure that's not compensation and benefits? We saw quite a bit of analysis while we were on the board suggesting that there were savings that would be possible if the system were independent and could actually independently contract for goods and services. In that zone of assessments, I did want to share one personal favorite of mine. I'm looking here on the report, the line item Capital Mall Plaza Debt Service, which is one of the costs of the Oregon University system. So a little sliver of the tuition dollars going to the Capital Mall Debt Service. The opportunities on the cost side are not just about buying things less expensively or the opportunity to structure compensation more flexibly. Those are opportunities. But I think there's also greater opportunities for shared services across the universities. Back office functions like financial aid, admissions, payroll, also student-facing functions like common curriculum and library management. So in theory, a lot of these things could be achieved with the current structure. There aren't necessarily statutory restrictions. In practice, the entrenched constituencies within the system, when combined with the external political processes, make those changes all but impossible. So the final thing I want to talk about very briefly is flexibility. The world in which higher education operates is increasingly global, and it moves at digital speed. Our students were born into this world, and they're comfortable with it. Our faculty, who are in the forefront of creating knowledge, are actually pushing it forward every day. And the staff who are responsible for leading and supporting these institutions have learned to work with that. The systems that actually govern both the organization and the financial structure of the Oregon University system, though, really is not positioned to move that fast. Resources have to be more fluid so they can move to their highest and best use, so they can serve student needs, and so that they can exploit opportunities. I've talked before about the budget process. There are 6,300 line items, I'm told, in terms of how that budget is put together. And in addition, the last few years have brought successive rounds of budget cuts, forcing the institutions to make a lot of short-term decisions that are far less effective if they'd been planned from the beginning. Most of them have been very prudent financial managers, and they've kept funds in reserve for potential budget cuts that may come. And earlier this year, about a third of those reserves were swept by the legislature, proving the old adage that no good deed goes unpunished. So finally, just to wrap my comments here, I do believe that higher education in Oregon needs and deserves greater support. It needs more resources. Equally important, I think the current structure of the system is an impediment to the efficient and effective use of the resources. I think we can increase revenues, reduce costs, and deploy resources more flexibly. But I believe that will require substantive change in the structure and the governance of the system. So let me turn it over to John.
Thanks, Don. Before I start, I want to acknowledge there's a lot of past and existing board members in the room. Raise your hand. I know you can't see that on the radio, but there's dozens of, well, probably a dozen people in the room that have been banging on these same issues. And while Don and Kirby and I have the advantage of being retired and we can talk about this now, a lot of people have been working on this issue. And I even had some calls when my letter to the governor got covered by the Oregonian. I got called by several past board members from 20, 30 years ago saying, we've been struggling with the same thing. So I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but it's up to us to figure this out. I woke up in the middle of the night, I think it was August 24th. I know that because the letter to the governor is dated August 25th, and was thinking to myself, I've spent 4 or 5 years of my life on this board, and what do I have to show for it? My wife said, well, maybe you should go write it down. I think mostly because she wanted to go back to sleep. But I did write it down, and then the next morning I read the letter, and unlike a lot of those letters we all write in the middle of the night, it didn't seem too bad. So I sent it around to Kirby and Don and some others, and I'm going to read you that letter. And then we can have questions and answers. It was dated August 25th to Governor Ted Kulongoski. Dear Governor Kulongoski, when you persuaded me to serve on the Oregon Board of Higher Education, I agreed for 2 reasons. First and most importantly, I don't believe we want a 2-class system of higher education where the great private universities build large endowments and cherry-pick the best faculty and students, while the public universities get underfunded and over-mandated and lose their ability to be excellent. Second, I agreed because you expressed a serious and genuine desire to reverse this trend towards a 2-class system and told me and fellow recruits to the board that everything was on the table. Well, now that I have retired, I put that in quotes, after 5 years on this board, I feel I owe it to you and others to summarize what I believe should be on the table and this is in capitals, must happen if we want higher education in this state to survive, let alone thrive and excel. Some or all of the following will likely find vehement disagreement from various stakeholders in higher education. 1, constitutional corporation. Higher education needs to be set up in its own public corporation with an ability to manage itself as an efficient, coordinated entity rather than a loose, less efficient confederation. This should include one line item of funding rather than 6,300 from the state, should include freedom to develop its own unique compensation system, revenue and expense autonomy, legal support, etc. The public mission would be essential to this corporation, and the Board of Regents would be charged to ensure that the public mission of access and excellence for Oregonians was upheld. I believe the constitutional corporate structure would further and enhance our public mission, not detract from it, as some would claim. 2, funding. This higher education corporation would covenant with the legislature and the governor to achieve certain quantities and qualities of deliverables for the state. In turn, the block funding should be determined with a simple formula. For example, no less than the U.S. median state contribution per student times the number of students Oregon wants to educate. In other words, Oregon's funding per student would need to be no worse than 25th out of 50 states. As you know, we are currently, in my letter I said 48th, I think it's this, in 08 it's moved up to 41st. This case can and should be made to Oregonians, but without putting our own house in order, it's difficult to ask for the investment, especially in this economy. 3, governance. To be asked to serve on this new Board of Regents for our public corporation should be the greatest honor a governor can bestow, not the arm-twisting effort it is today, and reserved for our brightest and most capable men and women. It should be no more than 9 to 12 people and self-perpetuating in that the board would nominate successive board members and seek approval from the governor. This allows a board to manage itself, hold itself accountable, and take a more comprehensive approach. While I have served with many wonderful student and faculty representatives on the Board of Higher Education, many of them are in this room today, this board should be a citizen board and not include those currently in the academy. There are other better ways for faculty and students and other constituents to have a seat at the table, which of course they should have. 4, CEO model. The public corporation needs to be established with a CEO model, and the CEO needs to have both the authority and accountability to pursue the mission of the board. If the board's directives, i.e. the state's mission, are not accomplished, the CEO serves at the pleasure of the Board of Regents. The current cajole model is not sufficient. 5, campus autonomy. The campuses need to have the day-to-day autonomy to manage their affairs, as well as the accountability to perform within the system. The amount of micromanagement our current structure invites is highly inefficient, wasteful, and really does not provide effective oversight. The university presidents need to serve at the pleasure of the CEO and the Board of Regents. 6, OHSU. OHSU should be part of this public corporation. 7, efficiency and creativity. The corporation should be empowered and required to explore creative ways to do more with less, including curriculum rationalization across the system, a coordinated and focused plan for Portland, online education. For example, we should lead the nation in web-based solutions as part of our systems offering. Boundaries and coordination with community colleges, technology and intellectual property transfer. 8, marketing. Governor, you and I explored some of this with Wyden and Kennedy and others, but this corporation needs to have a marketing campaign that reaffirms what higher education does for Oregon, as Kirby covered. The ROI to the Treasury, as well as the civic and regional benefits to the inner city and to the most remote ranch. We have not done a good coordinated job on making our case, and we continue to pay the political price. in closing, I realize the political obstacles regarding the above proposals are over my pay grade. But each and every item is essential, in my opinion, to the viability of public higher education in Oregon. Consequently, we do not have a choice. Thank you.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is Tony Yaccarino, who is the Research and Policy Director for the City Club of Portland, where he coordinates the City Club's nationally recognized and unique citizen-led, all-volunteer, nonpartisan research program. Prior to working at City Club, Tony taught American history at Reed College.
Thanks to our speakers today. Although Oregonians like to consider themselves pioneers, the model that you're proposing isn't entirely unique. Some version of it already exists in a number of other states. I may be wrong, but the limited knowledge I have on the subject is that this model in other states has indeed improved educational outcomes and put some institutions of higher education on a more solid financial footing, but perhaps at the cost of student access and affordability. Can you comment more generally on what Oregonians can learn from other states that have already adopted your proposed model, and more specifically on how such a change might affect the key issue of student access and affordability?
I'll take the first shot at that. When you think, and there are policy wonks out there that will, in the details, none of these are exactly the same as our general proposal, but when you think of states, right now if everybody wrote down 2 or 3 states in America that lead in higher education, a lot of them would have the same states on the list, and they include California, the UC system, Michigan, University of Michigan, Virginia, and other states. I used to have a pretty comprehensive list of all those states and their different governance models. I don't have those at the tip of my tongue anymore, but I don't think that anyone would seriously argue that that Michigan or California have not served their best, their brightest, imported the best and brightest, people of color, men, women, different age groups, the new challenges of higher education in this millennium. I think they have their own problems with funding now. I don't think anybody's escaped that, but we don't see. In fact, we see a continued pursuit, the way we're doing business today, as a way to ensure there won't be access and excellence for Oregonians, and that we will end up with a private-only system. So it's difficult for me to see how a change is not required to ensure that.
I just wanted to add one point, which is I don't think the system needs to have any reduction in accountability. I think what is most important here is that any system of higher education has to be accountable to the governor and the legislature and the citizenry of Oregon. The key is whether or not the system is accountable for outcomes and results, or whether it is caught up in all the micromanagement of an agency.
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. When you ask your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. I have really kind of 2 questions, both related to this state's financial support of higher ed. A lot of us look back to the good old days in the 70s, and I'm curious, going back further, how we looked, back then compared to where we are now in terms of state support. That's one question. Kind of related question is Oregon unique in this kind of crisis? Are there other members of state boards of higher education writing those same letters to governors in their states? So it's how do we compare internally to 30, 40 years ago in terms of state support, and how unique are we in this crisis compared to other states now?
The number I remember, I think it was 1920 or 25, the state supplied 85% of the budget. That could be off by a few years and a few percentage points, but it's basically, it's gone from 80 to 90% state funded to 15%.
I think the point, too, about where we stand, certainly the financial crisis has affected many states, but even before the crisis happened, there was certainly a number of factors that were really putting a lot of pressure on the system here in Oregon. I mean, certainly Measure 5, as well as some of the provisions around crime regarding building of prisons and all the other calls on the state budget. This erosion of the state commitment to higher education has been going on a long time, and the financial crisis now is a little over a year old. This is something that's been going on for quite some time.
My name is Susan Matthews, and I am a member of City Club. My question has, when I listen to what sounds like a very engaging model, how the CEO of this corporation is going to successfully jawbone the legislature to assure that it gets the funding that would be mandated, particularly since we've been living now for nearly 30 years in a very anti-tax mentality across the country. And I wonder if there doesn't need to be something more that, in fact, business, and you certainly represent some very successful businesses, can do to change the direction of that mentality so that the funding for education, as well as other critical services, can be assured. And I'm thinking most particularly of the referendum that's likely to face us very soon. Maybe you could address the broader context of insufficient funding, not just the fact that the universities are suffering.
I'll take a first shot. I think that, first of all, the covenant between this corporation and the legislature obviously and the governor need to control the purse strings. That you can't change that, and you shouldn't change that, but I think the covenant has to be a discussion on how many Oregonians are we going to educate. And we're going to educate them at no worse than the U.S. median. And so that means you get, today we have 75,000 full-time equivalent students in the system. So the conversation with the legislature is how, and we're funding it at least this level, it becomes math. And if the legislature says we're not funding you to that degree, then you're not going to educate 75,000 Oregonians. You're going to lower that number or increase that number as the case may be. I think, as Don talked about in No Good Deed Goes Unpunished, if you went to the business community and to Oregonians in general, and they really believed some corporate taxation would go, and Kirby can talk to this from Intel, if Intel really believed that this money was going to be incremental to higher education and not just lower the state's commitment further to higher ed, and let the business community make up the difference, I think there'd be a lot of support, and we've had a lot of conversations with Tim Nesbitt and the governor and others on this. I think there'd be a lot of support for funding higher education.
I frankly think business is critical, and John mentioned something that is near and dear to my heart. We haven't done a particularly good job of marketing, primarily because every time you put money in that budget, it gets pulled out again. With all those line items, it's pretty easy to pull that money away. But the issue is that business has got to be at the table for higher education. I don't think there is a better or more needy group, very honestly, because they are the recipients in many cases of the employees that come out of the system. So critical in my mind. And so my hope is, I was told before I came to the City Club, and I'll make my comment by somebody that attends periodically, that often these speeches are interesting speeches, but nothing happens afterwards. So my sense is if we are here and nothing happens afterwards, and the business community doesn't see what we're trying to get at here, and we let the higher educational system in Oregon fail as business people, we have wasted our time, in my estimation, because I think it's critical that we get going on this, and we've got to make the change. It's been around for a long time. We know we have to change, and we got to stop and get moving, and business has got to be at the table.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. One of the most disturbing statistics that's emerged in recent months is that Oregon is one of a handful of states that spends more on prisons than it does on higher education. My question, and I'll direct it to John von Schlegell, but others can comment on it as well, is does the success of the proposed model depend on changing that trend, that is, increasing the resources coming to higher education in Oregon relative to other services, or does it accept that as a reality and then carve a new path that can succeed without a significant increase in state resources?
Greg, that's a great question, and that's definitely over my pay grade, but I'll answer it anyway. That's what I do. But you have to believe, I think it has to be in your philosophy and your DNA, that higher education, a lot of people in Oregon see higher education as a luxury and not as a necessity for a state. If you believe higher education is the engine that pulls the train, then those types of questions get answered. You know, divorce rates go down, and abuse goes down, and prison, you know, all the drug use goes down. If you believe that higher education pulls high schools, and high schools pull middle schools, and middle schools all the way down, as opposed to pushing. So you have to believe that, and I think when if you have excellence in higher education, it raises the bar all the way down the system. Now, you know, other states that have funded higher education better than we have, do they have crime problems? Yes, they do, and like I said, that's over my pay grade.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other point here, which is I think one of the elements here is both resources as well as deployment, and I think they have to be continuously linked. There's a tendency to really focus on the resource side of the equation, and certainly that's an important piece of this. But we've been using this analogy. If you try to pump more water through the pipe, but there's a lot of leaks in the pipe, you just don't get very far. You need to actually pump more water, but you also have to fix the leaks. And so this, to me, is about both resources going in and how they're deployed. And what John's outlined as a proposal is one option that we believe is a great, great way to think about this, that you actually have a commitment around the resources, but you also have the things that will let you be more efficient on how you use the water.
Thank you.
I'm Jesse Cornetta, City Club member. Thank you all for your leadership on this subject. I think it's a very interesting discussion. My question is, so we've identified the problem, I've identified a solution. Maybe the three of you could talk for just a minute about what it's going to take to get this done. In the current climate that we're in a recession, and this seems to be a cyclical issue that comes up when states are in recessions. Most states, two of the three that you mentioned, have had their system of governance since statehood. So it's an incredible challenge to change the status quo. How do we go about doing that? And the final point being that the state is so apathetic about higher education. You've seen the polling, you've seen the work that's out there, and I think it's helpful to point out that I don't believe, unless I'm missing it, there's a single state legislator in the audience today. I think that's telling. These are the folks that ultimately have to pass these changes. How do we do it?
Take turns. Do you want to go?
Well, I can just start by saying I think everyone has a role to play here. I think that certainly we're going to need leadership from the political sphere in Oregon, and there's no question about that. We're also going to need leadership from the business community, as Kirby talked about. We're going to need the institutions themselves, and we're going to need the citizenry to step up and say, this is what we expect. And, you know, I think that the crisis here is not just a cyclical response to a financial downturn. These trend lines have been going on for a long time. And, you know, one of the things that I see as, you know, someone who's working for a global corporation is this is not only an issue in Oregon. We are probably in certainly 41st out of 50 in the United States. This is a U.S. issue. I look at the competitiveness of the United States against countries like China or Singapore or some of the emerging markets that are investing tremendous amounts of money in higher education and churning out a lot more educational attainment here. And that's not to say that we don't have the best higher education system in the world. I still believe the United States has the best system in the world. It's just not going to be sustainable. So I think everybody's got a role to play here, and it's not going to change if we just expect that it's going to have to come only from Salem. It's going to have to come from a lot broader population than that.
There's a lot of people that believe you can tinker with the system, adjust the system through existing laws and regulations. Some of the things Don talked about, we technically have the right within those 6,300 line items at the Board of Higher Education to address, but politically you don't have the right. So I personally do not believe that the answer is going to come from Salem. It's going to come from a constitutional corporation that needs to be done through a referendum. I'm not a politico, so I don't know how doable that is, but I do think if you went to the people of Oregon and said, we want to do more with less, this corporation request is not asking for more money today. I don't think asking for more money today is politically viable, but to say we want to do more with less and we want to have the flexibility that and accountability that Don talked about, I think that would be listened to.
Hi, my name is Steve Katz, City Club member, and I want to thank you for your service. And I just, as a non-educational stakeholder, except as a citizen, I was wondering if anybody thought about a regional concept for, say, Oregon and Washington as a joint university system where the sort of a regional university, such as PepsiCo, for example, going, you know, all over the country. So, thank you.
Just a comment from my standpoint. I think that's a lofty goal and probably not a bad one. But I think you got to take the first step before you can get there. As long as you've got your higher education system locked up as a state agency, I can't figure out how you do a regional step. I mean, you're just not rewarded for doing that, essentially. And that becomes very, very uncomfortable. One of the things that the board and actually the institutions and the faculty worked on during the time we were on the board that is just a phenomenal outcome is working on matching the curriculum and the transition between community college into higher education to get higher graduation rates for those students coming through community college into higher education. I'm very, very happy to say, boy, the work that went on there was just very, very impressive. And now students can have dual enrollment as they enroll in community college. They're already enrolled in a four-year institution, so that transition becomes very easily. But I have to tell you, nobody was rewarded for doing that. It became a very difficult situation because of the way we budget our educational institutions in Oregon. It just, you know, you absolutely reward the wrong things the way we've got it set up today, and that's really problematic.
Ted Falk, member. The gauntlet that John and I guess the others of you have thrown down is creating a public corporation modeled, I guess, on OHSU. Since we have three finance types up there, I thought I'd ask you whether you've thought of going one step further and going to a private nonprofit corporation model. There have been examples of other government industries like highways that have been recapitalized by converting them to private sector enterprises. Does this model offer any potential for higher education in Oregon?
Well, I will give you the very superficial answer here, which is I think there's a lot of work to be done to figure out exactly what the right structure would look like. I think John's letter to the governor outlined one option. What's really important for me personally, I won't speak for everybody at the table here, is not necessarily that legal structure per se. I'm not a smart enough lawyer and haven't done all the research right now to figure out what that might look like. But what I think is important is that you do have to have the independence to be accountable for results, but not micromanaged, and you need to have a covenant with the state that provides an appropriate level of resources. If there's another structure that gets that done more effectively, I think that's something that we should look at.
That has been looked at and is being looked at. At the end of the day, we're here and others for the public mission. So the public mission could be done through a private nonprofit. I think the accountability that's important to this governor and I think other governors has led us to talk more about a public corporation, but there are financing models, bonding, and other things that could be done if we could get a predictable flow of income to the system. There's a lot of financing options that would take up too much time today, but it's a great question.
Well, we've run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for this week. Please join us next week for a discussion about the state of Black Oregon. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speakers, Kirby Dyess, Donald Blair, and John Van Schlegell. We're adjourned.